Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come. It's wonderful to be back at this church. Like I say, it's been a couple of times before that I've been here. And the big topic which we're going to be looking at today is the evidence of design. We're going to use 3 different examples of evidence of design. And then we're going to try and sort of make, or rather answer the question, how would you recognize design or a design if it came up and hit you in the face? We'll get a bit more into that as we go, but you can see our organisation, Creation Research. You can see our website, our main website, creationresearch.net. creationresearchuk.com is our local website. I'd encourage you to check that out. I've been here a couple of times before, but just in case that I'm new to you, who am I? What do I do? What's my background? Well, I do travel all over speaking in various churches and conferences like this. We go out and we lead field trips. We led a field trip yesterday in the cold to the Isle of Sheppey. We like people getting hands-on with the evidence. And we're also involved quite intensively in research. This is what I've been involved in for the last 3 years or so. My academic background is geology. I specialised in paleontology, so that's digging up and uncovering fossils. Last year I was elected as a fellow of the Geological Society, which I was very pleased with. And so I get to go all over the world doing fun things like digging up dinosaur bones and working out how they glue back together again. Yes, there is some fun in ministry occasionally, but then I went on, once I'd done my undergraduate degree in geology, I went on to work as a zookeeper for 6 years, ended up doing qualifications in zoology, specifically around animal welfare and conservation. And in the last couple of years, I've been working on a doctorate in paleobiochemistry. It was a great big long word, basically to describe us going into old dinosaur bones and seeing if there's anything soft and squidgy left inside. And if you're interested in that, come up and speak to me afterwards. Well, the last year has been a pretty busy one since I was with you last. In particular, we had one research trip out to Morocco. I've always wanted to go to Africa, and I've particularly always wanted to go to Morocco, not just because of the sand and the scenery, but because of the going and the digging up of the fossils. It's one of the hot spots of the world for research. And we were going there to sort of scout out and sort of do a bit of a reconnaissance to talk about taking a film company over there, a Christian film company from the States, to actually film a documentary. So you can see me in a cave next to a man called Mohan. Now, Mohan is interesting because I asked him, is he a Muslim? And he said, sort of. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I'm a Muslim because I was born a Muslim. And in fact, most of Morocco is nominally Muslim, if not, very much supportive of Islam, and most people would identify as being Muslim in Morocco. And in fact, it's actually illegal in Morocco, imprisonable by up to 3 years in jail, to try and convince or convert a Muslim to another religion. And so while we were out there digging up all sorts of interesting fossils, me and 2 of my colleagues, both of them Christians who came out with me, were able to witness to Mohan and give him the gospel on multiple occasions and sort of drive him to the point of even starting to question things like, because he had the classic questions that Muslims have. How could Jesus be God if he was really a man? How on earth could God actually become a man? How does that even work? Where in the Bible does that even say that? And what was really remarkable is that we actually asked his permission for the 3 of us to hold a little communion service in his garden. He agreed. He wanted to watch in and listen. And so I prepared a little mini sermon. I scrapped that immediately, turned to John chapter 10, I and the Father are one, and was able to give him the gospel through our little witness of a communion service. I didn't tell my wife, by the way, that it was imprisonable by up to 3 years until I was safely out of the country. But do pray for Mohan, because he's now one of our major contacts in Morocco, both for research as well as for going and doing work there. And he really does seem to be open to the gospel. So it's been pretty busy, and a lot of these fossils from Morocco do end up in our Creation Research Museums project, where we have over 40,000 fossils and artifacts from across the globe. The museum has exploded in the last year, particularly since taking on a guy called Steve from a missionary background, who's come in and developed a whole load of displays, including this, after their Kind exhibition. After their kind, by the way, is a biblical term. It's used 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. And we have fossils on display here that show this biblical concept of after their kind. Charles Darwin called them living fossils, and he said they ought to be anomalies, and they're one of the biggest problems with his theory of evolution. And we make the point, and I'm sure I've made it here before, here's one Jurassic fossil squid from our after their kind display. And you were probably able to recognize that it was some kind of a fossil squid, even without the label, because even though these rocks are supposed to be 159 million years old, all you can prove is that in 159 million years, or supposed million years, squid have turned into squid. Right? They haven't changed, they haven't evolved. What they have done is reproduce after their own kind. And so you simply do not need the millions of years because there is no evidence for evolution in the rocks. So I'd encourage you to check out creationresearchcenter.com. That's our museum network ministry. You can support the museum ministry around the world, and I'd encourage you to sign up to our newsletters. You can find out how to do that over by the resource table. Well, our main topic, creation, the final proof. What evidence is there for creation? What evidence is there for design? And how would we be able to identify and define design? Because the reality is we're all very good at recognizing whether things are designed. We know that a guitar is designed. We know that a car is designed. We know that an aeroplane is designed. But defining design gets a little tricky. And we live in a world today where secular science tells us that things have not been designed, that things can happen by themselves. In fact, even a simple question like this, what is hydrogen, becomes quite spectacular. Because you see, if you want you go all sciencey, well, hydrogen is a very abundant element. It's a very explosive element, if you know your history. It's a very simple element. It's only made up of 2 parts instead of the normal 3. But the reality is, if you believe in atheistic evolution, that is, that no God exists and everything happened by itself, then you have to believe that hydrogen is a colorless, odorless gas that, given enough time, turns into human beings, all by itself. Because that's what the atheistic evolutionist believes, that in the beginning there was nothing but hydrogen, which, given enough time, developed into the stars, the planets, into life, up through the apes, into human beings, and beyond. They believe we're still continuing to evolve. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist and evolutionist, he said this in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He said, "The universe appears designed. But given enough time, evolution can create all things with the appearance of being designed." In other words, and there's all sorts of logical fallacies in here, but in other words, the point that he's making is he believes that time really is the key to evolution. Given enough time, evolution can happen by itself and can even give the appearance of design in the world around us. In fact, our international director, John Mackay, was debating Dr. Christokalos from Harvard University, and Dr. Christokalos strode on the stage and made this statement. He said, "A creation is something that cannot happen by itself." Now, I'm not entirely sure why he said that in a debate, because that's one of the best definitions of a creation that we've ever come across. We've used it ever since, because it really is. A creation is something that cannot happen by itself. A creation, by definition, requires a creator. It requires a designer. Well, if a creation is something that cannot happen by itself, then what is evolution? Well, an evolution is anything that can happen by itself. Only natural processes are involved, and no outside intelligence is required. Whereas a creation is anything that cannot happen by itself. And if you want the technical definition of a creation, the technical definition of a design, I'm going to give it to you now. It might take a moment to get your head around it, but we're going to spend the next half an hour or so working our way through this definition and using some very practical examples to help us along. Here's the definition of a design. The end result has properties that do not come from the original materials. Now, just pause and think about that for a moment, because we're going to work through that definition as we go. It may seem complicated to start with, but I promise you we'll get to it by the end. You see, with a creation, outside intelligence is always required. A creation will always prove that someone who was not part of it, someone who was greater than it, made it do what it doesn't do by itself. You see, here we're going to use three different examples to begin with. Three different examples of evidence for design. Three different examples as evidence for creation before we come back to this definition. Starting with a book from 1862 on the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects and on the good effects of intercrossing. They don't write them like that anymore. Who's it by the way? A certain Mr. Charles Darwin. You see, the reality is Charles Darwin was a very good scientist. He genuinely made some very interesting observations and came to some very important conclusions. This was one of them, the discovery of how important fertilization and intercrossing orchids is in order to produce new varieties. He spent years studying earthworms and revolutionized the way that we view agriculture, because he came to realize that earthworms are really important for healthy soils. The issue with Charles Darwin is that as he was studying the world, he began to notice that, well, his phrase was nature red in tooth and claw. Some of you may have heard of that. He was the one who actually coined it. And he noticed that the world around him was not always good. But there was killing, there was disease, there was struggle for existence. He even had a weed patch in his back garden where he sowed seeds and watched the weeds struggle against each other to survive. And he said there is no way that a good God could have created a world like this. And so he set out to try and show how he believed the world could come to be without God's involvement. You see, the interesting thing about Charles Darwin is that many people, although he did good science, many people associate him as a scientist. The reality is, Charles Darwin graduated with a Master of Arts in Theology. He actually studied the Bible. And by the way, this was back when in order to get a Master of Arts in Theology, you actually had to read your Bible. And so he would have read not only Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about God creating the world, but he would have also read about Genesis chapter 3, when the world went from good to bad. In fact, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it says that everything God created was very good. Genesis chapter 3 says that the man Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He listened to his wife instead of his creator. He chose his wife over his creator. And as a result, the world went from good to bad to worse, because he had sinned and the world was now changed. But even in the fallen, bad world that we live in today, we can still see elements of this good creation. We can still see areas where there are things that reflect that very good nature. I think that orchids are one of them. I think that flowers are one of them. I love flowers, particularly the orchids. We have botanical gardens in the UK and in Australia where we grow things like this. And in fact, God said, let the earth sprout plants according to their kinds. And God saw that those plants were good. And God looked at all that he had made, and it was very good. One of my most favourite flowers of all time, though, is this one here. This is a water lily. I think they're delightful. And we can ask the question, how long can you take to make a water lily? I mean, evolutionists believe that water lilies develop by themselves. In fact, they believe that land plants developed to go into the water and ended up producing water lilies. Well, maybe a better question to ask is, what would you need in order to make a water lily survive? What do you need in place? Well, there's our water lily. And water lilies, like all flowers, they produce this flower head because they need to be fertilized. They need to transfer pollen from one flower head to the other so that they can make the seeds. In particular, it's usually little tiny bees that will pollinate the water lilies. There you can see those tiny little bees. They fly in. This is out in Australia, by the way, but it's the same concept here in the UK. The little bees crawl around. You see all getting the dust of the pollen on them, and then they can take off and fly to another flower. Little problem. The water lilies are in the water. and they're quite far apart from each other. And water absorbs heat, it sucks heat out of the air. And so this little tiny bee, as it flies from one flower to the other, it begins to have its heat, its energy sucked out of it by the water below. And it might be able to make it to the second flower, but by the time it takes off and goes to the next one, it has lost all ability to fly. It has lost all energy because the water has sucked that heat out, and so the bee falls into the pond, it dies, and that's why both bees and water lilies are now extinct. Now, that's not the case, is it? Bees and water lilies are still here. So something must be going on, something must be happening. What's enabling these bees to continue to fly and to combat the energy issue that they have flying over water? Well, it's got something to do with, just that sort of what looks like a red hot center in the middle there. That's not actually too far from the truth. You see, for insects to get to these flowers, they must fly over the water, and so they need the ability to be able to be recharged at some point so that they have the energy to get to the next flower. Now, you can do this test at home. It's quite simple. This was done, like I say, in Australia. It's the same concept here. It's just the temperatures might be slightly different. You see, at this point on an Australian spring afternoon, the air temperature outside was 26.2 degrees centigrade. Nice and pleasant. The water temperature, though, was a much cooler 19.7 degrees centigrade, enough still to suck the energy out of that bee as it flies over the water. But by the time we get into the center of the flower, the temperature was 32.8 degrees centigrade, significantly warmer than both the outside temperature and the water temperature. In other words, when that little bee lands into the flower to start getting him covered in pollen, he gets a supercharged boost of heat energy, so he's got enough energy to fly on to the next flower. Amazing stuff. It was a group of scientists from Cambridge University that discovered this, and this is what they had to say about it. They said the implication that we're really most excited about is that flowers are cleverer than we thought they were. Question: are we really dealing with clever flowers here? No, what we're ultimately dealing with are silly scientists. Silly scientists who refuse to acknowledge what it says in Romans chapter 1 verse 20, that since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Creation shows cooperation. Cooperation is the norm in a good creation. Nothing in the living world works in isolation, and God created fully functioning ecosystems in the beginning, and even though we live in a fallen world, we can still see elements of this good world, even in cooperation between the bees and the flowers. The flowers have absolutely no reason to produce the heat other than the bees. And yet they're there because both the bee and the water lily's survival depends on each other. What about another piece of evidence for design? Well, here's another question. What has the fastest acceleration of all time? By the way, a little bit of a physics point here. Acceleration is not how fast you're going. Acceleration is how long it takes you to go from standstill to a certain speed. So now you think about it in terms of cars, right? In 0 to 60 describes our acceleration. So what has the fastest acceleration of all time? Maybe some of you think it's something like a speeding bullet. I mean, that goes from nothing in the gun to going pretty quickly in a very short space of time. Maybe it's a supersonic jet. Well, the reality is the fastest acceleration of all time can be found in this picture. Now, it's not the horse, it's actually on what's come out of the back side of the horse. Oh, you didn't think we were going to be talking about things like that on a Sunday morning, did you? But you see, there's the stuff that comes out of the backside of the horse, and what grows on the horse manure is a little fungus. It's a little fungus called a Pilobolus fungus. I grew up getting very much involved with fungus, and was involved with the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society. I spent many a happy hour on my hands and knees in the horse paddock looking for this kind of stuff. But you see, something must be working because you can find them in their abundance. There's the little fungus, by the way. You've got the stalk, you've got this little pressurized capsule, and you've got a spore that sits on the top. Think spore, think seed. It's not quite the same thing, but it's what allows that fungus to grow. It produces, that spore will produce the cells of the fungus called the hyphae, which intertwine into the mycelium, which is the main body of the fungus. That's what consumes whatever the fungus is sitting in, whether it be a stump or the soil or indeed horse manure. As it grows, it produces this fruiting body with this stalk, with this capsule, and with this little spore sitting on the top. Now, there's a little problem for this spore. You see, this spore needs two things. Number one, it needs to pass through the digestive system of a horse in able to trigger its growth. Because it will go through the digestive system of the horse, it'll be deposited on a lovely fresh pile of fertilizer in which it will be able to grow. The problem is no horse is going to go up to its own manure in order to eat it to get the seed inside of it, right? And so that little spore has got to find its way from sitting on top of the pile of manure over to a fresh blade of grass so that it can be eaten by the horse, not fully digested, but pass through the digestive system of the horse and be deposited with this lovely pile of fertilizer so it can grow. So how does it do this? Well, here's some footage from Miami University just a few years back, and they've slowed the footage down incredibly slowly so you can see exactly what happens. There's the little spore, and it eventually gets so much pressure that it blasts that little spore into the air. Some of these can fly over several meters, and this is a microscopic little spore here. It's quite remarkable. Fastest acceleration? Yeah, well, acceleration is quite a complicated concept to get over in terms of the maths, and this was actually studied and published in a journal. Here is the spore flight trajectory model detailing the acceleration of the spore. We all got that, yeah? Excellent. Let's try and put it into some slightly more understandable terms for what we might be able to relate to. Well, there's an average acceleration speed of 0 to 45 miles per hour in 2 microseconds. That is pretty speedy. This little spore will experience 20,000 times the G-force. Some of these spores, the Pilobolus, belong to a group of fungus called the Ascomycetes, or the spore shooters. There's lots of them that will shoot the spores out using various different techniques. The top speed we've ever found is 186 miles an hour, and many of them can be launched across several meters worth of ground. If we wanted to experience this level of G-force, we would have to be launched at about 100 times the speed of sound, or 756,777 miles per hour. So we've got some pretty serious numbers going on here from this tiny little spore, right? There's another problem though, because that little spore gets launched through the air, it flies through the air, it hits a blade of grass, but on the great blade of grass, there's a little droplet of dew, and so it sinks down through the dew, falls off on the ground, and the fungus goes extinct. Now that doesn't happen either, because you see, even the fungus spore is covered in little crystals called calcium oxalate crystals, which are what we call hydrophobic, literally water-hating. And so if it hits the little droplet of dew, it simply rolls off and sticks to the blade of grass so it can be eaten. The question you've got to ask is, how did all of this evolve from nothing, without intelligence, all at the same time? Because you need all of this in place. If you have the fungus, but you don't have the ability to blast it, you're going to go extinct. If you can blast the spore, but the spore can't cope with that G-force, it will disintegrate upon launch. If it can be launched, but it doesn't have the calcium oxalate crystals, then it will fall through and go extinct. And if it has all of that, but it can't cope with going through a horse's digestive system, then it will also die. All of these things need to be in place at the same time. Remember, what's an evolution? An evolution is anything that can happen by itself. There are only natural processes involved, and there is no outside intelligence required. Whereas a creation is anything that cannot happen by itself. The end result has got properties that do not come from the original materials, and outside intelligence is always required. A creation will always prove someone who was not part of it, someone who existed before it, someone who was greater than it, made it do what it doesn't do by itself. Let's look at one last example for evidence of design before we begin to conclude and wrap it all up together. Remember Richard Dawkins? The universe appears designed, he says, but given enough time, evolution can create all things with the appearance of being designed. There's no doubt about it, Richard Dawkins does not believe in a designer. He does not believe that the universe is designed. And he believes that evolution can produce things that remarkably give the appearance of being designed, even though they weren't. There ought to be some pretty significant evidence for evolution if this is the case. Well, Richard Dawkins has got something to say about the evolution process as well. He says this. He says, evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Now, what he's just told you there is that evolution hasn't been observed. Don't be surprised, by the way, that T.S. Kemp, who is a famous evolutionist from Oxford University, he says that to believe in evolution requires an extraordinary faith. I agree with him. You see, there's no doubt about it that Dawkins denies a designer. And some of his arguments come from the reality that there does seem to be some broken things out there in the world. In fact, one of the things that he claims are broken is mankind's eyes. In fact, he's actually on record saying that mankind's eyes are so badly designed, they must have evolved by random processes. This is the exact quote from his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, where, by the way, he attacks creation research personally by name. But he says this: the retina is back to front. He says the eye's photocells are pointing backwards, away from the scene being looked at. The wires connecting the photocells run to the brain all over the surface of the retina, so light has to pass through a carpet of masked wires before they hit the photocells. Now, some of us may have fallen asleep at the word photocell, so let's get some pretty pictures up. There's your classic high school textbook diagram of an eye. Okay, you've got a lens at one end on the left-hand side there. You've got the receptor cells in yellow on the right-hand side, and then you've got a lens that sits there, and you've got this big red blob in the middle, which is known as the retina. And the light passes through the lens into the back of the eye where it reaches those receptor cells. But in order for the light to get there, it needs to pass through this big red mass known as the retina. Here's a slightly more technical diagram. You can see the photoreceptors in blue on the right-hand side, and you see those red sort of spidery-looking things? Those are all the blood vessels that run throughout the retina. And Richard Dawkins is making this point. He says, look, you've got the light which is passing in from one direction, and it's got to pass in through this great big mass of red blood cells and blood vessels in order to reach the photoreceptor cells. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Surely you'd do it the other way around, so that the receptor cells are at the front. Well, what Richard Dawkins, number one, is not taking into account are these Mueller cells, which are the sort of the yellow spidery looking things. But aside from that, Dawkins is viewing the eye in your sort of your old-fashioned pinhole camera. You know, you've got a lens at one end, you've got a photo paper at the back, you click, the shutter opens, the light passes through the lens, through an empty space, and it hits the photo paper at the back, right? Now, if you were to get your hand and were to put it down in between the lens and the photo paper, what would happen? Not a lot, right? You wouldn't get a photograph. In fact, one might say that that would be an idiotic thing to do. Now, I use the word idiotic deliberately because that is the word that Richard Dawkins used in describing the one who designed the eye. He said that if it was up to him, he would send the eye back to whoever designed it. He said it's not just a bad design, he says it's the design of a complete idiot. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm quite glad that I'm not going to be in Richard Dawkins' shoes when he stands in front of the one who actually did design the eye. Because the Bible does say that we are going to be judged by every word out of our mouth, and the words that have come out of his mouth is to call the Creator, Jesus Christ, an idiot. Well, let's look at this claim of an inverted retina. An inverted retina sounds more scientific than the eye being back to front. It's not a new idea by any means. This is an old idea. It's this all vertebrate eyes follow this configuration of lens retina receptor cells. So it's not unusual in the world. It's not a one-off for mankind. It's a blueprint that is found across all of creation. So how do we answer this challenge? Well, like any evolutionary challenge, indeed any claim of vestigial organs, we don't just throw it out. We don't just say, well, clearly it's got no use or it's a bad design. The key is to do some more research, to actually find out why things are designed the way that they are. Let's take you back to our eye here. There's the lens. There's that big red mass of the retina. There's that yellow receptor cells at the back. Now, when the light passes through the lens, something happens to the light. I mean, if you go out on a hot sunny day and you get the garden hose and you go like that, what gets projected on the ground? A rainbow. Because the water acts like a lens and it begins to split the light apart, the red light at one end and the blue light at the other end. You know the famous experiment with Isaac Newton and the prism? You could do it with a magnifying glass as well. You produce a rainbow. Because as light passes through a lens, it begins to split. And that is exactly the same in your eye. As it passes through the lens, the red light and the blue light begin to split apart, and the point which the blue light hits your eye is different from the point that the red light hits your eye. And you would never be able to see anything. You would go walking around with a sort of a psychedelic rainbow effect everywhere. In fact, your eye very quickly would cease to work. Now, human beings do have sight. We've had sight ever since we've known human beings to be around. And so something clearly is not working in the way that Richard Dawkins thinks that the eye works. There's something different going on. Well, you remember those Mueller cells? They are the key. Because you see, when the light gets funneled through the lens, those Mueller cells run from the lens to the receptor cells. And they funnel the light into those cells. And those cells just so happen to be, notice the heavy sarcasm laid on there, the right length and the right thickness and the right width to bounce the light up and down and backwards and forwards, so that at the point that they leave the Mueller cells and they enter the receptor cells, the cones and the rods, the light has come back together again, and both the red light and the blue light are delivered at exactly the same point into the receptor cells. Now that's a pretty clever design. It actually amplifies the light as it needs to be through the lens, but delivers the light as it should be into the receptor cells. In fact, the people who did this research is a group based out of Israel, the Israel Institute of Technology, and they had this to say. They said the retina is revealed as an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of images. Hang on a minute, what did Richard Dawkins say? Well, he didn't say anything like that. He said it's not just a bad design, it's the design of a complete idiot. Whereas the researchers say it's an optimal structure designed for improving the sharpness of images. Question, now who's the real idiot? It's interesting to think about. You see, the inverted retina argument is not evidence of evolution, it's evidence of our ignorance. Because the actual evidence tells us that the eye is a very good design. Who's being an idiot? Well, it's certainly not God. Put it that way. In fact, we can see evidence of eye design even in the fossil records. This is a little bug called a trilobite. I've got a few of them for sale up the back. And trilobites are quite remarkable because they're sort of a shelled creature, a little arthropod, a bit like a woodlouse, you know, the roly-poly bugs. And they're preserved brilliantly in the fossil record, including, remarkably, their eyes. You can actually, we took these photographs under some microscopes, you can actually see the individual lenses on each eye. Get up nice and close, put it under scanning electron microscopes, and the eyes begin to reveal their structure. Pluck one of those eyes out, cut them in half in a cross-section, put that under a microscope, and this is what it looks like. This is a trilobite compound eye. Only known from the fossil record, by the way, but even in there we can see evidence of great design. There's the front lens, there's the back lens. This calcite is a shaped, curved, oriented piece of calcite. And there's a little strip of calcite that curves around and fits on the back of the eye like a bowl. Now, what's the design feature here? Well, that little bowl that sits on the back is actually a correcting lens. You see, if you don't have that, when the light passes through the oriented calcite, look what happens. You see that sort of rocket-shaped looking thing coming out the back? The focal plane, the light hits the focal plane at completely different places. That poor little trilobite would never be able to see anything. Stick that little curved bit of calcite on the back, that special little correcting lens, and all of a sudden the light hits at exactly the same place on the focal plane. There it is with and without the correcting lens. Can you see the difference? So there's even evidence of good design in the fossil record. Now, why am I telling you about this? Because it links back to our question about what a definition of a design is. Do you remember our definition? The end result has got properties that do not come from the materials that it's made of. Well, what materials is this eye made of? It's made of calcite. I'm a geologist, I know a thing or two about calcite. I know that calcite can produce stuff like these stalactites in the caves. Beautiful crystal formations. I know that stalactites produce these wonderful crystal structures. Do you know what I also know about calcite? It doesn't matter where you find calcite, if it's naturally formed in the world around us, calcite always has straight edges. Do you know what calcite can't do by itself? Calcite cannot produce a curved lens. It cannot produce a curved correcting lens that sits on the back of another curved lens. It cannot produce oriented calcite, because all of those things require curved edges, and calcite does not produce that by itself. Calcite always produces straight edges. The question is, though, could evolved DNA do this? Well, this is where we're going to finish up. But before we do, let me just issue a little challenge to Richard Dawkins. By the way, you don't have to be scared of atheists and evolutionists coming up with great and big and technical challenges. It's very easy to deal with objections like this, because Richard Dawkins genuinely believes the best evidence for evolution is not successive evidence of fossils over time, because he doesn't have any. It's not that we've proven evolution in the lab, because he's already admitted we haven't seen that. He believes the best evidence for evolution is the fact that things appear to be badly designed. And he stands up and he says, look, the eye is clearly a bad design. It's so easy to deal with this objection. Excuse me, Dr. Dawkins, how many eyes have you successfully designed recently? Do you know what the answer is? Absolutely none. In fact, even our best cameras do not come anywhere near close to the quality and the amazing design that we see in the eye, even in the trilobite eye. You see, when Dawkins is able to design a better eye than the one we've got, I will be impressed. But until then, I would suggest not calling God an idiot. You see, if you want an eye, if you want a design, if you want any of these things, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with a process. Get the process right and you can produce stuff. Now, we're limited in our ability to produce processes. God's obviously a lot better of it than us. But we can still apply this into the world around us to understand what a design is. We'll start simple. What's a guitar? A guitar is a 100% musical object made out of 100% non-musical wood. It's made out of wood that comes from trees. It's made out of strings that traditionally have been made of horsehair. Now, you can go and strum a guitar and it makes a wonderful noise. You can go and strum a tree and it's not going to make a noise. You can strum a horse and it might make a noise, but it won't sound like a guitar. But you see, if you put all those things together and you apply intelligence to it, somebody who is not part of the guitar, somebody who existed before the guitar, and somebody who is far greater than the guitar, you can actually make wood and horsehair do what they don't do by themselves. Remember, creation is something that cannot happen by itself. Guitars cannot happen by themselves. The end product, the musical instrument, has got properties, it makes music, that do not come from the materials that it's made of, the tree or the horsehair. Somebody who existed before the guitar, somebody who's not part of the guitar, and somebody who's far smarter than the guitar has made wood do what wood doesn't do by itself. A creation is something that cannot happen by itself. The end product has properties that do not come from the stuff that it's made of. And a creation will always prove somebody who's not part of it, somebody who existed before it, and somebody who's far smarter than it made those ingredients do what they do not do by themselves. I mean, what's a car? It's a 100% moving object made from 100% non-moving parts. Put it together in the right way, you've got a moving vehicle. The same can be said for a jumbo jet. It's a 100% flying object made from 100% non-flying parts. Let's get slightly more specific. What is a computer code? Well, a computer code is a 100% meaningful result made from a 100% meaning-free source. A computer code is ones and zeros. But 1 doesn't mean 1 and 0 doesn't mean 0. Those are just the symbols that we've used in order to represent the code that says when I press this button, it'll go to the next slide. But put together in the right order by somebody who's not part of the computer code, somebody who existed before the computer code, and somebody who's far greater than the computer code, it produces a code that enables us to do work on our laptop. In fact, codes are a brilliant way of understanding design, because if I was to stand up here and say to you, ... dash, 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 ... what am I saying to you? SOS. What code am I using? Morse code. Okay, it's called Morse code because, of course, Mr. Samuel Morse invented it, so we give the creator his due, but I just made noise out of my mouth and I gave you that code. Could I have given you that code using a whistle? Yes, I could. Could I have given you that code using a flashlight? Absolutely. Could I have given you that code using sticks and stones? Could have got it eventually. You see, the design is separate from the materials that it's made of, because sticks and stones and random whistles and noise do not make a code unless somebody who existed before it, somebody who's not part of it, or indeed the materials that it's made of, actually made the code do, made those sticks and stones, made that light, made that noise do what it doesn't do by itself. It codes so that you can understand it. A creation is something that cannot happen by itself. Codes do not and cannot happen by themselves. The end product, the code that you understood, has got properties, it conveys information that you understand that do not come inherently from the sticks, the stones, the light, or the whistle. Therefore, you pay the creator his due. That's why we call it Morse code. Last point. What is DNA? DNA is a 100% coded substance made from 100% non-coding parts. It's made of sugars, phosphates, and carbons. Most of that you probably ate for your breakfast this morning. Inherently does not contain any information, particularly information that codes for life. Put it together in the right way, you get an incredibly complex 4-dimensional coding structure that codes for every single living thing on this planet, with an inbuilt mechanism to make copies of itself, and a specific mechanism to stop itself from evolving. I hope you realize that you are designed to not evolve. Because, and it shouldn't surprise us, Genesis chapter 1, 10 times God says he created all living things to reproduce after their own kind. So don't be surprised that DNA has got a mechanism to stop it from mutating. Mutations are supposed to be the driving force of evolution, and yet we have a mechanism inside us to stop us from mutating. Now, granted, we live in a fallen world that's broken and mutations do happen, but it's at least partially working because we're not a big massive slime on the floor. Because we are designed, our cells are designed to reproduce after their own kind, which means that we as human beings are designed to reproduce after our own kind, just like every other living creature. You see, the original DNA shows all the evidence of a pre-existent, intelligent creator. Somebody who is not part of it, somebody who existed before it, and somebody who is far smarter than it. Therefore, you pay the creator his due. Question: who is the creator of DNA? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by this Word, and without the Word nothing was made that was made. This is a pretty powerful word we're dealing with here. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word, who is God, who is the creator of all things, is Jesus Christ. And it says in Romans chapter 1 verse 20 that he has stamped his very nature into creation so that mankind is without excuse. Yes, there is wonderful evidence for design, and now not only do you know some evidence of design, but you can even know the definition of design. And I would encourage you to use that not only to encourage yourselves, but also to be able to take the gospel into all the ends of the earth so that you too can declare the truth of Jesus Christ as our creator, savior, sustainer, and coming king. It's been wonderful to be with you again this morning. Thank you very much, and God bless.